The evening started like any other. I just wrapped up a long day at the studio and was itching to sit in my favorite chair, strum my guitar, and maybe work out the chorus for a song I'd been stuck on. My Malibu estate was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where I could leave the world outside and just be me. But as I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The lights in the living room cast a strange, almost theatrical glow through the curtains, and the faint sound of music drifted through the walls. It wasn't mine. Stepping inside, the scent of Vivian's favorite candle hit me. A vanilla and sandalwood mix she always lit when she wanted to relax. I thought maybe she was waiting for me, ready to spend a quiet night together. I called out her name, but there was no response. As I moved toward the living room, a new sound emerged, a low murmur of voices. Then, laughter. My heartbeat quickened, and my palms started to sweat. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing a scene that felt ripped straight from a nightmare. There they were, Vivian and Dex, laughing, tangled up in each other, oblivious to my presence. And they were in my father's rocking chair. That chair wasn't just furniture. It was a legacy, handcrafted by my dad when I was a kid. He used to sit in it every evening, telling me stories about life, music, and dreams. When he passed, it became a symbol of everything I wanted to live up to. And now, it was the setting for this betrayal. I froze, my entire body stiff with shock. My mind screamed at me to move, to speak, to do something, but I couldn't. Not at first. I just stood there, taking in the scene as rage built in the pit of my stomach. Dex was the first to notice me. His face drained of color as he scrambled to untangle himself from Vivian. I didn't give him a chance to explain. I strode forward, grabbed him by the neck of his shirt, and yanked him off the chair. He stumbled, barely keeping his balance, but I didn't let go until I slammed him to the floor. "You've got 10 seconds, I growled through clenched teeth, to get out before I finish what I started. Dex didn't argue. He grabbed his jacket and bolted for the door. The sound of it slamming shut was deafening in the silence that followed. Vivian, clutching a blanket around her, opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off with a look. "Don't," I said coldly, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. "Don't you dare." I stood there for a long moment after Dex left, staring at Vivian. She was sitting on the edge of the rocking chair now, pulling the blanket tighter around herself as if it could shield her from the consequences of her choices. Her lips parted like she was about to say something, but I shook my head sharply. "Save it," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "I don't want your excuses." The words hung in the air as I walked past her, heading for the one thing in that room I still cared about. My father's rocking chair. It felt almost surreal as I reached down, running my hand along the worn wood. The anger simmering inside me flared up as I thought about how she'd desecrated it. That chair wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a piece of him, of us, and now it felt tainted. Without saying another word, I hoisted it onto my shoulder and left. Behind me, I heard her voice, panicked now. "Orion, please, can we just talk about this?" I didn't stop, didn't even look back. The door slammed behind me, and I stepped into the cool night air, gripping the chair like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. My car was still in the driveway, but I didn't feel like driving. Instead, I walked, my mind racing with every step. By the time I reached the cliffs overlooking the ocean, I was out of breath. The chair felt heavier than ever, and so did everything else. The betrayal, the humiliation, the way my own home had turned into a stage for their twisted little drama. I set the chair down and sat in it, staring out at the water. The waves crashed against the rocks below, relentless and chaotic, mirroring the storm inside me. My dad used to say that life was like the ocean. Always moving, always changing. Some days it's calm, other days it's rough, but it never stays the same. But right now I felt stuck. Frozen. Like the moment I walked in on them was on an endless loop in my mind, playing over and over again until I couldn't think of anything else. I pulled out my phone, the temptation to call someone, anyone, tugging at me. I needed to tell someone what had just happened. But who? The guys in the band? No, they'd pick sides, and I didn't trust any of them to stand by me after Dex. Family. My mom. I couldn't drag her into this mess. In the end, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there until the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. When I finally stood up, the weight of everything came crashing back down on me. I lifted the chair again and started the long walk home, each step fueling the rage that was now bubbling just beneath the surface. By the time I reached the driveway, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this slide. They'd both made their choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. The house was silent when I returned. Vivian's car was still in the driveway, and the living room light glowed through the curtains. For a moment, I thought about walking in and demanding answers, but the sight of the rocking chair I'd left in the garage reignited my fury. I entered through the kitchen and found her on the couch, knees to her chest, clutching her phone. Her makeup was smeared, and she looked up at me like a cornered animal. "Orion," she started, standing quickly, but I cut her off. "No," I said coldly. "You don't get to talk. Not yet." Her mouth opened, then closed as she sat back down, guilt and defiance flickering across her face. "I want you out of this house. Today." Her eyes widened in shock. "You can't be serious. Do I look like I'm joking?" My voice was flat. "Pack your things and go. I'll call my lawyer and have the papers drawn up." Tears welled up as she stepped toward me. "It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking straight." "Don't downplay this," I snapped. "You planned this. You lied to me, used my house, my father's chair." My voice hardened with every word. She flinched, tears spilling over, but instead of remorse, defiance returned. "You've been so distant, Orion. Always at the studio, always with your music. I was lonely." "You were selfish," I shot back. "You didn't talk to me. You didn't try. You just blew it all up." Her lip trembled, and she sank back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, voice muffled. "I don't care," I said bluntly. "Call Dex. He'll take you in." She flinched again, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt. But it passed. "You have until the end of the day," I said, turning to leave. "After that, I'm changing the locks." As I climbed the stairs, her quiet sobs echoed behind me. A part of me wanted to go back, to listen, to try to understand, but I knew it would just be more excuses, more lies. Trust was gone, and so was the life we'd built. In the bedroom, I grabbed a suitcase and started packing. Not for her, for me. I couldn't stay in this house, surrounded by these memories. I needed space to think, to plan my next move. As I zipped up the bag, I made a silent promise to myself. This betrayal wouldn't break me. I'd lost my wife, my trust, maybe even some dignity, but I wasn't going to lose myself. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. I left the house that afternoon without looking back. My suitcase felt heavier than it should have, and not just because of its contents. Every step away from that front door felt like a battle between anger and the ache of what I'd lost. My Malibu estate, my wife, and the life I thought I had, they all seemed distant now, like relics of another life. I drove aimlessly at first, letting the miles roll by without a destination in mind. The silence in the car was unbearable, so I turned on the radio, only to have one of our band's songs play. Hearing Dex's guitar solo felt like a punch to the gut, and I slammed the radio off. Betrayal was everywhere. There was no escaping it. Eventually, I ended up at a hotel just outside the city. It wasn't much, just a simple room with a bed, a desk, and a view of the parking lot. But it was quiet, and that was enough. I threw my suitcase onto the bed and sank into the chair by the window, staring out as the sun dipped below the horizon. The weight of it all pressed down on me. The lies, the humiliation, the sheer audacity of what they'd done. I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my contacts. My thumb hovered over Dex's name. I wanted to call him, to scream at him, to demand answers. But what was the point? He'd already shown me who he was. Instead, I opened a search for private investigators. If Vivian and Dex thought this was the end of it, they were wrong. The next day, I met with the investigator at a cafe near the hotel. He was an older guy, grizzled but sharp, with a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. I laid everything out. Vivian's affair, the scene I'd walked in on, and my suspicion that this wasn't her first betrayal. His expression didn't change as he jotted down notes. "Anything else I should know?" he asked, sipping his coffee. "Yeah," I said, my voice hardening. "I want everything. If she's been lying to me, I want to know how far it goes. And Dex, dig into him too. I don't care what it costs. He nodded, sliding a card across the table. I'll be in touch. Leaving the cafe, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since the night I found them, I had a plan, a way to take back some control. If they'd taken from me, I'd take everything from them. Back at the hotel, I sat down with my guitar, trying to work through the tangled mess of emotions the only way I knew how. The notes came slowly at first, disjointed and raw, but soon a melody began to emerge. Something dark and powerful, pulsing with the anger I couldn't put into words. The music was my escape, my way of processing the chaos. And as the first lines of lyrics began to take shape, I realized it wasn't just about venting my pain. It was about reclaiming my story, turning their betrayal into something that was mine. The investigator didn't waste time. 3 days later, I got a call. You were right about her, he said, his tone clipped. It wasn't her first time. I'd braced myself for this, but hearing it confirmed hit differently. It felt like the ground beneath me crumbled a little more. How far back does it go? I asked. Years, he said, then added after a pause, there's more. Dex isn't clean either. You're going to want to see this in person. We met at his office later that day. He had everything laid out, a stack of printed photos, emails, and text messages. Some were old, from Vivian's affairs before Dex. Others were recent, explicit exchanges between her and Dex that made my stomach turn. But the real gut punch was the file on Dex. He's been siphoning money from the band for years, the investigator explained, tapping a ledger. Fake expenses, side deals with promoters. It's enough to cause some serious damage. I stared at the pile in front of me, the full extent of their betrayal laid bare. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was the lies, the manipulation, the sheer audacity of it all. They'd turned my life into a farce, and I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. Thank you, I said, my voice steady despite the fire burning inside me. Send me everything. As I left the office, my mind raced with possibilities. Dex's theft could ruin his reputation, maybe even land him in legal trouble. And Vivian? She thrived on her image. Polished, perfect, untouchable. If that image shattered, so would her world. Back at the hotel, I spread the documents across the bed, studying them like a battlefield map. Dex would be the first to go. He'd betrayed not just me, but the band, our fans, our legacy. He deserved to be exposed. I called a band meeting the next day, telling everyone it was urgent. When we gathered in the rehearsal space, the atmosphere was tense. Dex, oblivious, smirked at me like nothing had happened. It made what came next even more satisfying. I've got something to share, I said, tossing the file onto the table. It's about Dex. Everyone leaned forward as I walked them through the evidence. Every stolen dollar, every shady deal. Dex's face went from smug to pale in seconds. This is ridiculous, he stammered. You can't prove. Shut up, I snapped, cutting him off. I don't need to prove anything. The band deserves better, and you're done. The others didn't hesitate. One by one, they agreed to kick Dex out. As he stormed out of the room, his protests echoing down the hallway, I felt a flicker of vindication. It was just the first step, but it was a start. Vivian was next. But she wasn't just going to lose me, she was going to lose the life she'd built on lies. Vivian's betrayal ran deep, but I knew her well enough to understand what mattered most to her. Control, appearances, and the admiration of others. If I was going to make her pay, I needed to hit her where it hurt the most. The investigator's findings gave me what I needed, but I wanted the impact to be unforgettable. I started with a phone call. Vivian, I said, my tone cold but steady, we need to talk. Alone. Meet me at the lake house this weekend. She hesitated, likely wondering if this was some kind of olive branch. Why there? She asked, her voice tentative. It's private, I replied. We owe each other at least that much. There was a pause before she agreed. Fine. The lake house was miles away from the chaos of Malibu, a secluded retreat we'd bought early in our marriage. Ironically, it had been my idea, a place to reconnect during rough patches. Now, it was the perfect setting for what I had in mind. I arrived 2 days early, spending hours transforming the house into a gallery of her lies. Photos of us from happier times lined the walls, each one paired with captions I'd written, a mix of sarcasm and brutal honesty. Beneath a smiling photo of us at an award show, I wrote, "The night you lied about business meetings." In the dining room, a collage of text messages from her various affairs was displayed, the details of her deception laid out like an open book. The centerpiece was in the living room, a projector looping the video of her and Dex in my father's rocking chair. The footage had been captured by the security cameras I'd installed years ago, meant to deter burglars. Instead, it caught something far worse. By the time Vivian arrived, the house was a shrine to her infidelity. She stepped inside and froze, her eyes darting from one display to the next. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I stepped out from the shadows, leaning casually against the wall. "Enjoying the show?" Her face paled as she spotted the projection in the living room. She stumbled forward, trying to turn it off, but I'd hidden the controls. "Orion, please," she begged. "We can fix this." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Fix this? You mean fix the mess you've made of our marriage, my trust, and my life? Tell me, Vivian, where do we even start?" She turned to face me, her usual composure shattered. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear." "Stop," I said, my voice cutting through her excuses. "Don't insult me with more lies. Everyone who matters has already seen this exhibit." I held up a list of her business contacts, friends, and acquaintances. They all got a preview. Anonymous packages. "I'm sure the tabloids will have it soon too." Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, staring at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. "Because you didn't just betray me, Vivian," I said, my voice hard. "You made me a fool in my own home. And now, everyone will see you for what you really are." I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked out the door, leaving her in the ruins of the life she'd carefully constructed. As I drove away, the weight on my chest began to lift. She'd made her choices, and now she was living the consequences. The drive back to the city was quiet, the hum of the car the only sound as I processed what I'd done. I wasn't sure if it was satisfaction or exhaustion settling in, but one thing was clear, I was done being a victim. Dex and Vivian had taken enough from me, and it was time to reclaim my life. By the time I got back to the hotel, my phone was already buzzing. Texts, missed calls, voicemails. Most of them from Vivian. She begged for forgiveness, threatened legal action, and alternated between anger and despair. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I focused on the next phase of my plan. The investigator's file had included details on Dex's financial misdeeds, and I wasn't going to let that slide. I spent the next few days quietly reaching out to industry contacts, promoters, producers, and venue owners, sharing what I'd found. Word spread quickly, and before long, Dex was blacklisted from the music scene. His face might have been all over the tabloids thanks to Vivian's scandal, but his reputation in the industry was dead. With Dex out of the picture and Vivian's social circle imploding, I turned my attention inward. For years, my music had been my escape, my therapy. But now, it felt like the only way to truly move forward. I poured everything into writing, every ounce of anger, betrayal, and pain. The words came easier than they had in years, and soon, a new song began to take shape. The song, The Last Note, was raw and unapologetic, a story of loss and revenge wrapped in a melody that refused to be ignored. It wasn't just about Vivian and Dex, it was about me, about reclaiming my voice and my identity. I called the band together to share it. They were hesitant at first, wary of the tension Dex's departure had left behind, but as soon as they heard the first chords, they were hooked. We recorded it in a single session, the energy in the studio electric. When The Last Note dropped, it was an instant hit. Fans flooded social media with praise, calling it my best work yet. They didn't know the full story behind the song, but they felt the emotion, the raw honesty. It was cathartic, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been wronged and needed to rise from the ashes. The song's success gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I started planning a tour, one that would take me far from the shadows of Vivian and Dex. But before I hit the road, I had one last piece of unfinished business. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer to finalize the divorce. Vivian had tried to reach me through legal channels, but I made it clear, there would be no negotiations. She could have the house, the car, even the lake house if she wanted it. All I cared about was walking away clean, free of the baggage she'd created. When the papers were signed, I felt lighter. The chapter with Vivian was officially closed. I wasn't naive enough to think the scars would disappear overnight, but I was ready to move forward, ready to start fresh. With the divorce finalized, I focused on the one place I still felt like myself, the stage. My team booked a series of concerts to promote The Last Note, starting with a sold-out show in Los Angeles. The city buzzed with anticipation, and so did I. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of betrayal, and now, I had the chance to channel all that pain into something powerful. The night of the show, I arrived early at the venue. Standing backstage, I took a moment to absorb the hum of the crowd. This wasn't just another performance, it was a turning point, a declaration that I was still standing despite everything. When the lights dimmed and the band walked on stage, the roar of the crowd was deafening. I gripped the mic, my heart pounding as I gazed out at the sea of faces. The first few songs were classics, easing the audience in, but when we reached the last note, the energy shifted. The opening chords were haunting, and as I sang the first line, the room fell silent. It was as if the entire audience was holding its breath, hanging on every word. I poured everything into the performance, every ounce of heartbreak, anger, and defiance. By the time the final note rang out, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the venue like a wave. The night wasn't over yet. For the encore, I'd planned something special. A symbolic act to close the chapter of my pain. My father's rocking chair, the same one Vivian and Dex had desecrated, had been brought on stage earlier in the show. Now, it sat in the center, illuminated by a single spotlight. The crowd murmured as I walked over to it, picking up a worn guitar I rarely used. I looked at the chair for a long moment, the memories of my father mixing with the betrayal it had come to symbolize. Then, without hesitation, I smashed the guitar against it. The crack of wood echoed like thunder, and the audience gasped before breaking into wild cheers. Piece by piece, I destroyed the chair, splintering it until it was unrecognizable. When it was done, I dropped the shattered remains at my feet and stepped back to the mic. That, I said, my voice steady, was the last tie to the pain. We move forward now. The crowd roared, their energy washing over me like a bomb. For the first time in months, I felt truly free. After the show, as I packed up backstage, my phone buzzed with messages from friends and fans. One caught my attention, a message from Lila, an old friend from my hometown. It was simple but struck a chord. Proud of you, Orion. Let's catch up soon. Something about her words stayed with me. They felt real, genuine, something I hadn't had in a long time. I tucked my phone away, a small smile tugging at my lips. Maybe it was time to revisit the life I'd left behind, to find the pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. The destruction of the rocking chair wasn't just an act for the crowd, it was a release. The burden of betrayal didn't vanish overnight, but for the first time, it felt manageable. I packed my things and hit the road, the next stop on the tour calling me forward. The shows kept coming, each one more electric than the last. Audiences were captivated by The Last Note, and I could see how deeply the song resonated with them. It wasn't just my story anymore, it was a universal anthem for anyone who'd been wronged, for anyone clawing their way back from heartbreak. Despite the whirlwind of the tour, Lila's message stayed in the back of my mind. Lila had always been a grounding presence when we were younger. She wasn't flashy or complicated, just honest and kind, with a quick wit that could slice through any pretense. I hadn't seen her in years, but her message felt like an anchor, a reminder of who I was before all of this chaos. During a break in the schedule, I decided to take her up on her offer. I texted her, keeping it simple. Hey, Lila. Heading your way in a week. Let's catch up. Her reply came quickly. Sounds perfect. Same coffee shop? It's still here, though we're both overdue for some updates. The prospect of seeing her brought a strange mix of anticipation and nervousness. I didn't know what to expect, but something about reconnecting with someone from my past felt right. A week later, I pulled into the parking lot of the small-town coffee shop where we'd spent so many afternoons as kids. The place hadn't changed much, still the same faded sign and mismatched furniture inside. But when I walked in, there she was, and suddenly, everything else faded away. Lila looked up from her drink, her face breaking into a wide grin. She hadn't changed much. Her hair was a little shorter, and there were faint lines at the corners of her eyes, but her warmth was the same. She stood and hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I felt like I was home. "You haven't aged a day," she said, stepping back to look at me. "Still the same rock star I remember." "And you," I replied, smiling, "still know how to make an entrance." We spent hours catching up, talking about everything and nothing. Lila listened without judgment as I told her about Vivian, about Dex, and the aftermath of it all. She didn't offer platitudes or advice, just a steady presence that made it easier to speak the truth. When the conversation turned to her, I learned that she'd stayed in town, working as a teacher and volunteering at a local animal shelter. She seemed content, grounded in a way I envied. As the sun began to set, she glanced at her watch and sighed. "I should let you get back to your glamorous life," she said with a teasing smile. "Glamorous isn't exactly the word I'd use," I replied, standing up. "But this felt right. We should do it again." "Anytime," she said, her eyes bright. "You know where to find me." Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Lila hadn't just reminded me of who I was. She'd shown me what was possible. A life built on honesty, trust, and real connection. For the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope. The days that followed my meeting with Lila felt different, lighter somehow. Her words and her calm presence stuck with me, a contrast to the chaos I'd been living through. While the tour rolled on, I found myself thinking about her more often than I expected. Between shows, I began texting her. Small things at first, like photos of quirky roadside stops or updates on how the tour was going. She'd reply with stories about her students or funny things happening in town. It wasn't much, but it was real, genuine. It reminded me of the kind of connections I'd been missing. One evening after a show, as I sat in a quiet hotel room, my phone buzzed with a message from Lila. "What are you really looking for, Orion?" The question caught me off guard. I stared at the screen, unsure how to answer. 4 months, I'd been running. First from Vivian's betrayal, then from the pain that followed. The tour had given me something to focus on, but Lila's question made me realize I didn't have a clear destination in mind. What was I looking for? Closure? Happiness? A way to feel whole again? I typed back slowly. "Honestly, I don't know, but I think I'm starting to figure it out." Her reply came quickly. "That's a good place to start." A few days later, we had a longer break in the schedule, and I decided to visit her again. This time, we skipped the coffee shop and met at the animal shelter where she volunteered. The place was small but bustling, with dogs barking and cats lounging in the sun. Lila was in her element, moving easily between the animals and the people who came to adopt them. "You sure know how to pick a relaxing spot," I joked as she handed me a leash attached to a scrappy little terrier. "Life's never boring here," she replied with a grin. "Come on, you're on walking duty." We spent the afternoon walking the dogs through the shelter's trails, talking about everything from music to her work. She asked about my plans after the tour, and for the first time, I admitted that I wasn't sure. "Maybe it's time to slow down," she suggested gently. "You've been running for so long, Orion. Maybe it's time to figure out where you really want to be." Her words stuck with me long after I left. Slowing down wasn't something I'd ever been good at, but the idea lingered. 4 years, my career had been my anchor, my way of coping with everything life threw at me. But now, for the first time, I wondered if it was enough. Back on the road, I started making changes. I cut down on the post-show parties, spent more time writing music that mattered to me, and less time chasing the spotlight. It felt strange at first, but also freeing. I began to see that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something new. And Lila? She was becoming a bigger part of that picture. Every time I talked to her, I felt more like myself. Not the platinum-selling musician or the man trying to outrun his pain, just Orion. The tour wrapped up in a flurry of applause, encores, and goodbyes. The last note had become a symbol of triumph for the fans, but for me, it marked the end of something bigger. As I stood on stage during the final show, the spotlight warm on my face, I realized I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I'd found it in my own way, one note at a time. After the last bow, I stepped backstage, the adrenaline fading as the reality of what came next set in. There was no next tour on the horizon, no immediate project demanding my attention. It was just me, and for the first time in years, that felt okay. A week later, I found myself packing for another journey, though this one didn't involve stadiums or crowds. I was going home, not to Malibu, but to where it all started. Lila had invited me to a community fundraiser in town, and though it was a far cry from the events I was used to, the idea of seeing her again made the decision easy. When I arrived at the venue, a modest town hall decked out with string lights and handmade banners, it was like stepping into a different world. The air buzzed with laughter and conversation, the kind of easy warmth that had been missing from my life for so long. Lila spotted me from across the room and waved, her smile lighting up the space. She made her way over, balancing a tray of cupcakes that looked suspiciously homemade. "You actually came," she said, teasing. "Didn't think you'd trade the VIP lounges for this." "I figured it was time to downgrade," I replied with a grin, taking the tray from her hands. "What's the plan?" "Charm the crowd with your baking." "They're a distraction," she said, rolling her eyes. "You're here for the real work. Come on." She led me to a small stage where a few musicians were setting up. "We're doing an open mic later," she explained. "Figured you could handle it." "An open mic?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "You realize I'm not exactly low profile, right?" "That's the point," she said, her expression softening. "This isn't about your career, Orion. It's about being here, with us." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, my music had been about proving something, to fans, to critics, to myself. But standing there with Lila, I realized this was different. This wasn't about a brand or an image. It was about connection. When my turn came, I stepped onto the modest stage, the wooden floor creaking under my weight. The room fell quiet as I tuned my guitar, the familiar ritual calming my nerves. Then I started to play, not one of my hits, but something new, something I'd written during the quiet moments on tour. The song was raw, stripped down to just me and the guitar. It wasn't about betrayal or revenge. It was about hope, about finding your way back when everything feels lost. As the last chord rang out, the room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the roar of a stadium. It was something deeper, more intimate, genuine. Lila was waiting at the edge of the stage when I stepped down, her eyes shining. "That," she said softly, "was the best thing I've ever heard you play." For the first time in a long while, I believed it. After the fundraiser, the quiet charm of the town pulled me in. I hadn't planned to stay, but something about the place, its simplicity, its sincerity, made it hard to leave. Lila and I spent more time together, our connection deepening with each shared story and unhurried moment. She invited me over for dinner one evening, a homey affair with mismatched plates and the smell of something roasting in the oven. Her dog, a clumsy golden retriever named Milo, barked happily as I walked through the door, his tail wagging like a metronome. "I hope you're not expecting five-star dining," she joked, tying an apron around her waist. "It's spaghetti and meatballs, not filet mignon." "Sounds perfect," I said, settling onto one of her well-worn kitchen chairs. "I've had enough fancy food to last a lifetime." As we ate, conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Milo's attempts to steal a bite from the table. Lila asked about the tour, about life in the spotlight, and I found myself sharing more than I expected. Not just the triumphs, but the loneliness that came with them. The pressure to always be on, to live up to expectations that felt impossible. She listened without judgment, her presence steady and warm. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she said softly. "Not to your fans, not to Vivian, not even to yourself. You've already done more than enough." Her words stayed with me long after I left that night. They echoed in my mind as I drove back to my rental, the darkened streets quiet under a blanket of stars. 4 years, I'd been chasing something, success, validation, redemption, but for the first time, I wondered if maybe I didn't need to run anymore. The next day, I canceled my flight back to the city. I wasn't ready to leave. Instead, I spent my mornings wandering the town, my afternoons working on new music, and my evenings with Lila. It felt like I was learning to breathe again, to live without the weight of expectations pressing down on me. One afternoon, I found myself back at the animal shelter, helping Lila clean out kennels and walk the dogs. As we sat on a bench, watching Milo chase his tail in the distance, she turned to me with a small smile. You're different here, she said, her voice thoughtful. Lighter. Happier. Maybe it's the company, I replied, half joking. But there was truth in my words. Being around her, in this town, made me feel more like myself than I had in years. Her smile widened, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence wasn't heavy or awkward, it was comfortable, like we didn't need words to fill the space between us. That night, back at my rental, I picked up my guitar and started writing again. Not out of anger or pain, but out of something softer. Something that felt a lot like hope. Over the next few weeks, the town started to feel like home in a way Malibu never had. It wasn't just the place, it was the rhythm of it, the way people seemed to genuinely care. And Lila, of course. She wasn't just part of my days anymore. She was becoming the best part of them. One morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. Visit my parents' house. The old family home was only a short drive away, and though I'd been avoiding it, the pull of familiarity was too strong to ignore. My father's voice echoed in my memory as I pulled into the driveway, reminding me of simpler times before the chaos of fame. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but it still held the same warmth. My mom opened the door, her face lighting up in surprise. "Orion," she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. "I didn't know you were back." "Just for a bit," I said, stepping inside. The smell of her baking hit me instantly, and I couldn't help but smile. "Still making those pies?" "Always," she replied with a grin, leading me into the kitchen. "Sit down. Tell me everything." I wasn't sure where to start, but once I did, the words came easily. I told her about Vivian, about Dex, about the fallout. She listened quietly, her hands busy kneading dough, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. "I'm sorry you went through all that," she said softly, wiping her hands on her apron. "But I'm proud of you, Orion. You didn't let it break you." Her words stayed with me as I drove back to town. For so long, I'd been focused on what I'd lost. My marriage, my trust, my sense of stability. But maybe she was right. Maybe surviving was its own kind of victory. That evening, I shared my visit with Lila as we walked through the park. The sun was setting, casting the trees in golden light, and Milo trotted happily ahead of us, occasionally stopping to sniff something interesting. "You know," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I don't think I've been this honest with anyone in years." Lila glanced at me, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe you just needed the right person to listen." Her words hit me in a way I hadn't expected, and before I could overthink it, I stopped walking. She turned to face me, her brows knitting in confusion. "Lila," I said, my voice steady but soft, "I think I've been running from a lot of things for a long time. But being here with you, it feels different. Like I'm finally starting to figure out what matters." She didn't say anything right away, but her eyes softened. "I've always believed in you, Orion," she said finally. "Even when you didn't believe in yourself." In that moment, it felt like something shifted, like a bridge between us that had been half built for years was finally complete. I reached for her hand, and she let me take it, her grip firm and warm. As we continued walking, hand in hand, I realized I didn't need to have all the answers right now. For the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing exactly what came next. The change between Lila and me wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. We moved from long talks and shared moments to something deeper. It wasn't rushed or dramatic, just a quiet, natural progression, like finding a song you didn't know you'd been humming all along. One evening, I found myself at her place again. This time, it wasn't for dinner or a walk with Milo. It was just us, sitting on her porch, the stars scattered across the sky above. She handed me a mug of tea and sat down beside me, her knee brushing against mine. "I never asked," she said after a moment, her voice soft, "but what are you hoping to do now? After the tour, after everything?" I stared out at the quiet street, the questions settling over me. "I don't know," I admitted. For so long, my life has been about the next album, the next show. But now, I just want to live for a while. Find out what that even means. She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "You've got time. No one's rushing you." "Maybe," I said, turning to her. "But I feel like this is where I want to be. At least for now." Her smile was small but genuine, and it made my chest ache in a way that felt oddly comforting. "I think you'd like it here," she said. It's not glamorous, but it's real. Glamour's overrated, I replied, my tone light but honest. And real sounds pretty good. Over the next few weeks, I started to build something resembling a routine. I helped Lila at the shelter when I could, played open mic nights at the coffee shop, and even started volunteering at the local community center. It wasn't the fast-paced, high-pressure world I'd known for years, but it felt good, steady, grounded. The town welcomed me in ways I hadn't expected. People were kind but not overly impressed by my fame, which was refreshing. They treated me like a person, not a brand, and it gave me the space to breathe. One day, as Lila and I walked through the market, an older woman stopped us. "You're Orion Vale, aren't you?" she asked, her voice warm but curious. I braced myself for the usual fan reaction, but she surprised me. "I've heard your new song," she continued. "It's beautiful. I can feel the pain in it but also the strength. Thank you for sharing that." Her words stuck with me, a reminder of why I'd started making music in the first place. It wasn't about the fame or the accolades, it was about connection, about giving people something real to hold on to. That night, I told Lila about the encounter as we sat on her couch, Milo snoring softly at our feet. "I think I forgot what music could mean to people," I said quietly. "What it could mean to me." "You're remembering now," she said, her hand resting lightly on mine. "That's what matters." Looking at her, I realized she was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing anything. I was simply here in the moment, and it was enough. Months passed, and life in the small town began to feel more permanent. My time with Lila grew deeper, our bond shifting from rekindled friendship to something neither of us could deny. She brought a sense of balance I hadn't realized I was missing. Steady where I'd been chaotic, calm where I'd been stormy. One crisp autumn morning, I sat in the park with my guitar, the leaves falling lazily around me. Lila was nearby with Milo, tossing him a ball while he bounded through the grass. Watching them, I felt a rare kind of peace. It wasn't just contentment, it was the absence of the weight I'd carried for so long. As I strummed the guitar, a melody emerged, soft and unhurried. The notes carried something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Lila must have noticed, because she wandered over and sat beside me, Milo plopping down at her feet. "That's beautiful," she said, leaning against me. "New." "Just started it," I replied, my fingers still moving over the strings. "It feels different, like a fresh start." "You've been through a lot," she said, her voice low but steady. "Maybe it's time to let that show in your music." Her words stayed with me as I worked on the song in the following weeks. It wasn't like anything I'd written before, not raw like The Last Note or brooding like the songs I'd written during my marriage. This one was lighter, a reflection of the life I was starting to build. A life I never thought I'd want but couldn't imagine leaving now. By the time winter arrived, the song was finished. I played it for Lila one evening in her living room, the fire crackling softly in the background. As the final note faded, she smiled, her eyes bright. "It's perfect," she said simply. The next step was releasing it. I reached out to my manager, who was thrilled to hear I was writing again. The release was quieter than my usual splashy debuts. No major marketing campaigns, no endless press tours. Just the song and the story behind it. When it finally hit the airwaves, the response was overwhelming. Fans called it my most heartfelt work, a testament to resilience and growth. Messages poured in from people who'd faced their own betrayals and found hope in the song. It reminded me of why I'd started this journey in the first place. Lila and I celebrated with a quiet dinner at home. As we sat together, the snow falling gently outside, I realized how far I'd come. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, it was still part of my story, but it didn't define me anymore. What defined me now was this: the music, the small-town life, and the woman sitting across from me. As the night wound down, I took her hand and smiled. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." She squeezed my hand, her eyes soft. "I think so too." It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was better. It was real. And for the first time in years, it was mine.